They banished humanity. We closed the gates and left the galaxy behind. The vote was already finished when Envoy Michael Vance sat down. He had watched the bioluminescent pads ripple across the assembly floor in a single cold wave, each one shifting from amber to red in the time it took a man to blink. 127 systems. Not one held back. The red spread across the chamber like dye dropped into still water, and when it was done, High Arbiter Zalvian tilted his great plated head and smiled the way a man smiles when he is certain the animal in the cage cannot reach the latch. "The decree is confirmed," Zalvian said, his voice dropping through the low frequencies the Sunder League favored, the kind of sound you felt in your back teeth before you heard it with your ears. "All human trade charters are hereby revoked. Systemic banishment takes effect at the close of this session. The Sunder League Assembly thanks the human delegation for its service tier." He used those exact words, service tier. Vance turned the iron signet ring on his right hand once, slowly, the way a man turns a valve before he shuts it off for good. He did not stand. He did not raise his hand to address the floor. He pulled the formal acknowledgement document from the slim case on the table in front of him, signed his name in 3 clean strokes, and placed the stylus flat on the page. Then he stood, tucked the case under his arm, and walked out of the Prism concourse without looking back at a single one of the 127 delegates watching him go. Behind him, on the monitoring screens above the high dais, a small amber indicator had appeared in the lower right corner of a panel no one was watching. It was not alarming. It was barely a flicker. But it was the 14th such flicker in the past 90 seconds, and the panel it sat on controlled the pressure feeds for the Valari transit yards. Zalvian did not see it. He was still smiling. "The part that still keeps me up at night, that comes later." 3 weeks before the vote, Director Keth had stood in a supply corridor on the 42nd sublevel of the Vantic Directorate's regional branch and watched a human maintenance tech recalibrate a brass pressure gauge bolted to a coolant line the size of a transport hull. The gauge was old. Not old by Vantic reckoning, which measured things in centuries, old even by the tech's own admission, which meant it had been installed sometime before Director Keth was born, and had been tended by human hands without interruption since. The face of it was dark slate behind a polished brass rim, and the needle sat steady at mid-dial the way a needle sits when it is right, when the pressure behind it is exactly what it is supposed to be, held there by someone who knows which value to hold and which to bleed. The tech's name badge read OSI. He had said nothing when Keth arrived. He just reseated the calibration pin, tapped the glass face twice with 2 knuckles, and moved to the next junction point down the corridor without being asked. Keth had filed no report about it. There was nothing to report. A human had done a routine job without a word. That was not news. 3 weeks later, standing in the upper observation tier of the Directorate's monitoring hub with her terminal showing 14 amber indicators and climbing, she thought about OSI and that steady needle. She thought about it a great deal. The Prism concourse had been built at the intersection of 7 interstellar trade corridors, which meant that on a clear cycle, standing in the upper ring of the amphitheater, you could watch cargo move. Not metaphorically, literally. The great armored transit tubes swept past the concourse's outer windows in slow, geometric arcs, ore from the Dragon extraction fields, water ice from the cooler belt, processed grain concentrate from the 9 colonies in pressurized red canisters the size of small buildings. It was the most trafficked point in the 7 ring sectors. There was a plaque near the main entrance that said so, in the 418 languages of the Assembly's member systems. No one on the Assembly floor had stopped to look out the windows during the vote. If they had, they would have seen that the transit tubes were already running lighter than they should have been. Not empty, not alarming, just lighter. The kind of lighter that made you think the morning shift was slow and the afternoon shift would pick it back up, and there was no reason at all to check the sub-manifest for who had clocked out of the logistics relay 2 hours before the vote and had not clocked back in. Vance walked through the concourse atrium without pausing. He passed the plaque. He did not read it. He had read it many times in the years since the Outer Rim Accords, and it had never once listed the species that ran the pipes behind the words. He pushed through the main exit, and the recycled air of the concourse gave way to the sharp mineral bite of the outer transit corridor, ion-filtered, processed, the kind of air that had been breathed and cleaned and breathed again 1,000 times before it reached a person's lungs. You got used to it. Everyone did, except the humans, who had insisted on a slightly different filtration ratio for their own quarters across every station in the sectors, and who had quietly managed the filter arrays for so long that the settings had simply become the standard, and no one had ever asked why the air tasted the way it did. Vance stepped into the corridor and kept moving. 17 light minutes from the Prism concourse, a woman named Supervisor Adiz Chen was sitting at the primary operations board of the Valari Transit Yards and doing something that looked, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. She was filling out a decommission log. The Valari Yards handled the transfer and repair of deep space maintenance hulls, the slow, heavy, unglamorous ships that kept the atmospheric processors, water reclamation arrays, and thermal distribution grids of the 7 ring sectors running. There were thousands of them registered to the yards at any given time, and the paperwork for a routine decommission was standard work, the kind of work that generated no alerts and drew no flags. Chen was decommissioning 14,000 of them. She did it in the same order she did everything, methodically, from the first hull number to the last, working through the list with the quiet focus of someone who had done this particular kind of work for a long time and understood that the way you do a thing matters as much as the thing itself. Each entry took her roughly 4 seconds. She did not rush. She did not slow down. When the list was done, she saved the file, locked the board behind a key sequence that only her administrative code could release, and began packing the small personal items from her desk into a cloth bag. A framed picture, a calibration tool she had used since her first posting, a small brass pressure gauge that had sat on the corner of her desk for 11 years. She tucked the gauge in last, nestled between the picture and the tool. She picked up the bag, turned off the desk lamp, and walked to the docking level to catch the first outbound transport. The board behind her was already showing 3 amber indicators. By the time she reached the docking level, it was showing 9. No announcement came from the human quarters in the sectors. No broadcast, no statement, no recorded response to the Assembly's decree. That silence was the first thing Director Keth noticed. In her experience, a sentient population stripped of its legal standing in a system made noise at legal challenges, public appeals, protests logged through the formal petition channels. The noise was predictable. The noise was manageable. The noise was the thing you responded to and waited out and occasionally suppressed. And eventually the population accepted the new terms and you moved forward. There was no noise. There was only the amber wall. By the end of the first 12 hours after the vote, Keth's monitoring terminal showed 19 separate infrastructure subsystems flagging reduced operational throughput. Not failure, not collapse, reduced. The word the automated systems used was below threshold, a polite way of saying that the line pressure was dropping, the cycle rates were slowing, and the backfill protocols were not finding the inputs they expected. Keth pulled up the sub-manifest for the maintenance hull registry at the Valari Yards and found it blank. Not empty, blank. The kind of blank that happens when a file has been decommissioned cleanly, by someone with the correct authorization, in the correct order, without a single procedural error that could be used as grounds to reverse it. She stared at the blank manifest for a long time. Then she began pulling every other infrastructure log she had access to. And what she found What she found under the orderly surface of 14,000 clean decommissions and 9 amber indicators, and a silence that was already spreading across the sectors like the quiet before a very particular kind of storm, was a project 11 years old. It had no title in any registry she could reach. It had been built in the spaces between other projects, funded through maintenance budgets that no one above the human logistics tier had ever reviewed in detail, and it had been executed so slowly and so evenly across 11 years that its individual parts had never triggered a review flag. She did not know what it was called. She would learn later that the humans called it the Threshold Directive. What she knew, sitting at her terminal at the end of the first 12 hours, was that the amber wall had grown to 31 indicators, and none of them were going back to green on their own. She clicked her lower mandibles 3 times rapidly before she caught herself. Then she opened a direct channel to the Emergency Security Committee and began composing the fastest report of her career. The Emergency Security Committee met in the low-tier deliberation annex, which was 3 levels below the main assembly floor and smelled of recycled coolant and the faint mineral residue of ion scrubbers running at reduced capacity. Keth noticed the smell the moment she stepped in. She had not noticed it before, in 11 years of working in this building. She noticed it now because she had just spent 4 hours reading human maintenance logs, and she now knew that the scrubbers in this wing had not been serviced since the 3rd quarter of the previous cycle, because the team assigned to them had been quietly reassigned 8 months ago to the Threshold Directive's secondary logistics chain. The committee had 7 members. All 7 were present, which was itself unusual. Committee quorum required 4, and full attendance at an unscheduled session meant someone had already read the alert summary and understood that this was not a routine briefing. High Arbiter Zalvian was not present. He had not been invited. The alert had been routed through the Intelligence Directorate, not the Assembly Chamber, and the distinction mattered. Keth set her terminal on the briefing table and pulled up the sector map. "I will be brief," she said. 31 infrastructure subsystems are below operational threshold across the 7 ring sectors. The cause is not mechanical failure. The human workforce has begun a coordinated withdrawal. One of the committee members, a Velsaran delegate named Praxis, whose secondary breathing slits flared when he was processing difficult information, leaned forward. "A strike action." "No," Keth said. "A strike action is reversible. Workers refuse to work and then negotiate the terms of their return. What I am looking at is an extraction. They are removing themselves and everything they brought with them. The maintenance hull registry at the Valari yards has been cleanly decommissioned. 14,000 hulls. Not abandoned, decommissioned, in proper order with correct authorization codes, by the people who were authorized to decommission them." The room was quiet. "They are not coming back," Keth said. The committee's first response was to request a status report from the automated servitor arrays, the backup systems that Zalvian had referenced in the assembly chamber when the question of human replacement had come up in the pre-vote consultations. The arrays were a point of assembly pride. They had been engineered over decades to reduce organic dependency in the logistics tier, and the briefing documents for the banishment vote had included a full technical assessment, concluding that the arrays could absorb the human maintenance workload within 72 hours of transition. Keth had read that assessment. She had read it very carefully, because it was her job to read things carefully, and what she had found was that the assessment had been written by a technical review body that had never once consulted the humans who maintained the systems the arrays were supposed to replace. The status report came back in 11 minutes. The arrays were operating at 63% of their projected capacity. Praxis read the figure twice. "That cannot be right." "It is right," Keth said. "The arrays were designed to interface with the infrastructure as it existed in the engineering models. The humans did not maintain the infrastructure to match the models. They maintained it to match reality, which diverged from the models in approximately 412 documented ways over the past 3 decades. The arrays are running the models. The models do not match what is in the pipes. She pulled up a secondary screen. It showed a Hydroloop schematic for Sector 3's atmospheric processing chain, a branching diagram of pressure lines, valve arrays, and circulation nodes that looked, at first glance, like an ordinary engineering document. On second glance, the color coding told a different story. The lines the automated systems were managing showed in blue. The lines that had gone to manual hold were orange. There were far more orange lines than blue ones, and every orange line had a notation attached. Last service date, last calibration, last manual balance, all of them performed by human technicians, none of them replicated by the arrays, because the arrays had no protocol for a procedure that was not in the original specification. They built workarounds, Keth said, hundreds of them, over decades, each one small enough that it never triggered a review. Collectively, they are the reason the system works. The arrays cannot replicate a workaround they were never told about. The room was quiet again, and this time it stayed quiet longer. 40 light minutes away, in the outer transit corridor of the Prism Concourse's docking ring, Envoy Michael Vance was doing something Keth would not have found unusual at all if she had been able to see it. He was waiting for a transport. He sat on a plain bench in the waiting area with his slim case across his knees and his hands folded on top of it, and he watched the other passengers move around him. A Dregan merchant family with 4 pieces of luggage and a child who kept pressing her face to the transit window. 2 Velsaran officials in the same gray corridor uniform, speaking in low tones. A maintenance tech in a green work suit who sat 3 benches down, also waiting, also unhurried. The tech's bag was cloth. It sat between her feet, and the corner of a brass pressure gauge was just visible above the lip of it, catching the corridor light in a warm, dull gleam. Vance glanced at it once. He did not look at it again. His transport was called at the 40-minute mark. He stood, picked up his case, and joined the boarding line without looking at the departure board to confirm the destination. He already knew where he was going. He had booked the passage 11 months ago, on a quiet afternoon in his office in the Outer Rim, using a travel authorization that had been perfectly valid at the time of booking and would become invalid approximately 3 hours after he boarded. He found his seat, set the case under it, and turned to look out the transit window as the docking ring fell away. The Prism Concourse shrank behind him. The 7 transit tubes that swept past its outer shell were running visibly lighter than they had that morning. Not empty, not alarming, just lighter. The way a river runs lighter when someone, very far upstream, has begun to change where the water goes. Vance turned the iron ring on his finger once, then folded his hands in his lap and closed his eyes. By the 36th hour, the amber wall had become a red one. Keth had not slept. She had not eaten. She had consumed 2 cups of a Vantic stimulant that tasted of copper and allowed her to maintain focus for approximately 30 hours before the cognitive cost became too high to ignore, and she was on the 2nd cup now, which meant she had about 6 hours left before she became unreliable. She intended to use them. The sector map on her terminal now showed 47 subsystems flagged critical. The atmospheric processors in sectors 2 and 5 were running at 51% efficiency. The water reclamation arrays in the cooler transit hub had dropped to 38% throughput, not dangerous yet, but at current decline rates, dangerous within 72 hours. The food distribution arrays for the core systems were operating normally for now, because the core systems were newer and more heavily automated. But Keth had been tracing the supply chain backward for 6 hours, and she had found, buried in the transfer logs, that the processed grain concentrate the core systems distributed came from the 9 colonies. and the 9 colonies' packing lines were staffed almost entirely by human workers who had stopped clocking in at the end of the previous cycle. The concentrate would run out in 12 days. She had flagged all of this. She had sent reports up 3 separate chains of authority. She had received 2 acknowledgments and 1 automatic routing confirmation. The High Arbiter's office had not responded. Zalvian was in his private reception chamber when the aide finally reached him. He had been reviewing the next cycle's legislative calendar, which was a thing he preferred to do in the evening hours, in the low amber light of his chamber's bioluminescent panels, with the particular sense of satisfaction that came from having moved the Sunder League's agenda forward by a meaningful and irreversible step. The aide, a young Velsaran named Sel, entered with the careful body language of someone delivering information they would rather not deliver. Zalvian noted the posture, found it predictable, and did not look up from the calendar. "The Directorate report," Sel said. "I read the summary. The full report contains additional data. High Arbiter. Director Keth is requesting a personal audience." Zalvian set the calendar down. His 4 segmented eyes narrowed to the particular configuration that meant he was about to say something he had already decided was the final word on the subject. The automated systems are rated for full operational continuity within 72 hours of service transition. If there is a lag, it is a lag. The Directorate is managing an adjustment period. The Directorate is describing the adjustment period as Sel checked the message pad. A structural dependency collapse. The Directorate, Zalvian said, with the patient precision of someone correcting a very simple error, is an intelligence body, not an engineering body. They are reading pressure data and extrapolating beyond their competency. The service tier can be replaced. That was confirmed in the pre-vote assessment. He picked up the calendar again. "Tell the Director I will review her full report at the week's end." Sel held the message pad for a moment without moving. His secondary breathing slits opened and closed twice. Then he said, very carefully, "The Directorate's current projection for critical system failure across the 7 ring sectors is 72 hours. High Arbiter. Not from today. From the close of the Assembly session." Zalvian looked up at that. The Assembly session had closed 36 hours ago. He looked at Sel. Sel's breathing slits were still. His face had the particular stillness of someone who has delivered the message and is now simply waiting to be told what to do. Zalvian was quiet for a long moment. "Schedule the audience," he said. Keth was crossing the 3rd-level corridor toward the High Arbiter's reception floor when her terminal chimed with a new alert. She stopped walking, read it, and stood in the corridor for 3 seconds without moving. Exodus Convoy, one had just cleared the inner transit lanes. She knew what Exodus Convoy 1 was. She had identified it in the traffic logs 4 hours ago, a formation of civilian transports that had filed departure documentation for a routine outer ring resupply run 3 weeks prior, before the vote, before the threshold directive had been activated, and whose actual cargo manifest, when she had finally traced it back through 6 layers of routine logistics filings, had turned out to be not resupply equipment but people. 11,000 people, organized by household, with personal effects packed to the weight limit, their transit documentation in perfect legal order, their departure logged and cleared at the standard automated checkpoint with no flags, because nothing about any individual document was irregular. 11,000 people, moving in flawless geometric formation, and they were only the first convoy. She pulled up the broader departure log and found 4 more convoys flagged for clearance in the next 36 hours. She found 7 more flagged for the 36 hours after that. The number of people represented in the pending departure logs was large enough that she stopped calculating the total and simply stared at the column of convoy identifiers. Each one logged, each one cleared, each one moving in the right direction at the right speed with the right documentation. The whole vast quiet thing organized with the kind of patient thoroughness that only happens when someone has been planning it for a very long time. 11 years, she thought. Her mandibles clicked before she could stop them. She started walking again, faster. Keth did not knock on the High Arbiter's reception chamber door. She pressed her authorization code to the panel and walked in. Zalvian was standing at the far end of the room with his ivory sash straightened, and his 4 eyes in the narrow configuration that meant he had already decided the shape of this conversation. Cell stood to one side holding a message pad, his breathing slits carefully still. Keth set her terminal on the briefing table, turned it to face the Arbiter and said, "The automated arrays are at 41%. She watched the number land. It landed the way a dropped instrument lands, not catastrophically, but with a hard, flat sound that meant something had been damaged. "That is not possible," Zalvian said. "The pre-vote assessment was built on engineering models that do not match the physical infrastructure," Keth said. "The humans maintained the systems to a functional standard that diverged from the spec documents in hundreds of places. The arrays are running the specs. The specs are wrong." Zalvian's 4 eyes moved to the terminal screen. The sector map was open on it. The same branching color display Keth had shown the committee, except now the ratio of orange to blue had shifted further. There was a great deal of orange. "Show me the atmospheric chain for Sector 3, he said. She showed him. He stood looking at it for a long time. His segmented jaw moved once, then stopped. The ivory sash was very white against the silver plates, and very still, and Keth watched his eyes move across the schematic the way eyes move when they are reading something that does not make sense yet, and then makes sense all at once, and the sense it makes is not the sense you wanted. "How long have they been planning this?" he said. It was not quite a question. 11 years, Keth said, at minimum. The room was quiet. Outside, through the panel wall, the recycled air of the building's circulation system moved through its ducts with the faint, almost inaudible hiss of a system running at reduced pressure. Keth heard it. She had not heard it before today. She suspected she would hear it from now on, the way you hear a sound differently once you know what makes it. Zalvian turned from the screen. His eyes had changed configuration, not the narrow certainty of before, but something wider, something that in a human face Keth might have called the beginning of a recalculation. "We invoke the emergency servitor protocols," he said. "We bring the arrays to full." "The arrays cannot go above 41%, Keth said. "Not without the workaround documentation, and the workaround documentation was maintained in human-managed systems that are now locked behind administrative codes we do not have. The humans wrote the back doors. They took the keys." Cell's message pad chimed. He looked at it and his secondary breathing slits opened fully. He said nothing. He simply turned the pad so Keth could read it. Exodus Convoy 4 had just cleared the inner transit lanes. 3 more were queued behind it. The convoys moved in silence. That was the thing Keth kept returning to in the hours after the briefing, while she sat at her terminal watching the departure logs and the sector alerts with equal and mounting attention. There was no signal sent ahead, no statement of purpose, no broadcast to the assembly's emergency channels, no message to the press networks that ran their feeds across 50 billion neural links. The convoys simply moved, enormous, orderly, hull after hull in the clean geometric lines of people who had been told exactly where to go and had gone there without drama. A ship called the Gantu's Promise led the third convoy. It was a converted cargo hauler, wide-hulled and slow, and its passenger manifest had been filed correctly and cleared automatically 3 weeks before the banishment vote. On board were 612 people, including a woman named Supervisor Adiz Chen, who had taken a seat near a transit window and placed her cloth bag on the floor beside her feet. The corner of the brass pressure gauge caught the light from the window as the ship accelerated away from the inner lanes. the needle behind the glass face swinging once and then steadying, the way needles do when the thing they are measuring has found its level and holds. Across the ship, in a small compartment near the forward section, a woman named Ife was telling her daughter that the stars they were moving toward did not have names yet, which meant they got to name them, which meant they could name one anything they wanted, even something silly, even the name of the little gray fish her daughter kept in a bowl on her bedroom shelf back on the station. The daughter, whose name was Amara and who was 7 years old, thought about this seriously for a moment, and then decided the star would be called Puddles. The ship moved on. The assembly convened in emergency session at the 48th hour mark, in the main amphitheater of the Prism Concourse, under a lighting configuration that the building's automated system had dimmed by 11% due to reduced power throughput in the main distribution grid. Half the delegates noticed the dimming. Half of those understood why. Zalvian addressed the floor from the high dais. His ivory sash was still pristine. His voice was still low and rhythmic, but the four segmented eyes had not returned to the narrow certainty configuration since the briefing, and Keth, watching from the upper observation tier, noted the difference the way an analyst notes a pressure reading that has moved off its baseline and has not come back. The emergency servitor deployment is proceeding, Zalvian told the assembly. Projected timeline for full operational restoration, 96 hours. A delegate from the Dragon Systems raised a biopad. The current projection from the Directorate puts critical failure across the 7 rings at 72 hours. You are describing a 96-hour solution to a 72-hour problem. Zalvian's jaw moved. The Directorate's timeline is based on incomplete modeling. The Directorate's timeline, the Dragon delegate said, with the particular calm of someone who has checked a number twice and is certain of it, is based on the same infrastructure data that the pre-vote assessment was based on. The pre-vote assessment projected full automated continuity in 72 hours. The automated systems are at 41%. The Directorate's modeling has been correct. The pre-vote assessment has not. The chamber was quiet. The dimmed lights sat over the 127 delegate pads in a way that made the whole floor look slightly colder than it had that morning. From the observation tier, Keth watched Zalvian's eyes. He knew. She could see that he knew. The assembly floor could probably see it too if they were watching the right thing instead of their own pads. The certainty that had carried the banishment vote, the certainty that a species ranked as a service tier could be subtracted from the system the way you subtract an item from a list, was not narrowing his eyes into confidence anymore. It was doing something else, something that had no clean name in Vantic political language, that lived in the space between the moment a load-bearing structure cracks and the moment it falls. He was calculating how the crack had happened. He had not yet calculated that the structure was already falling. "We will contact the human delegation," he said. "We will open a channel to Envoy Vance and discuss an interim arrangement." Keth's terminal chimed. She looked at it. The final human extraction fleet, the heavy industrial hulls, the engineering ships, the last of the 14,000 units that had been quietly unregistered from the Valari Manifest, had just entered the outer transit corridor heading toward the outer ring threshold gate at 30% of light speed. There was no Envoy Vance to open a channel to. He was on one of those ships. The threshold gate was not a structure most people in the Sunder League Assembly had ever thought about carefully. It had been built in the early decades of the post-expansion era, when the outer ring of inhabited space was still being mapped, and the engineering problem of maintaining transit coherence across the perimeter had required a physical solution, a set of massive warp-capable transit locks that could open and close the deep space transit lanes, keeping the outer ring connected to the inner systems, keeping the trade routes stable, keeping the 7 ring sectors from drifting into isolated pockets of unreachable space. The humans had built it. That had been in the records if anyone had looked. Keth had looked in the 48th hour, while the emergency session was still running above her. The original engineering contracts, the construction logs, the maintenance schedules, all of it in the records, all of it signed by human technical authorities, all of it completely unremarkable until you read it in the context of a sector map that was 60% orange and a departure log that was 60% gone. The gate's control architecture had been designed with a master override protocol, which was also in the records. The override required a specific administrative code sequence, input from the deep space side of the gate, by an authorized operator. The authorized operator list had 3 names on it. All 3 were humans. All 3 were, as of the current moment, on ships approaching the gate at 30% of light speed. Keth read this. She read it twice. She looked at the departure log, at the extraction fleet's current vector, at the gate's control documentation, and she understood the full shape of the threshold directive in that moment, the way you understand the shape of a thing when you finally step back far enough to see all of it at once. They had built the gate. They had written the override. They had kept the authorized operator list current for decades, through every political shift and every assembly reshuffling, never making noise about it, never drawing attention to it, just maintaining it. The way OSI had maintained the pressure gauge. The way Chen had maintained the hull manifest. The way 10,000 hands had maintained 10,000 systems quietly, without credit, until the day came when they could simply stop. She opened a priority channel to the assembly floor. "High Arbiter," she said, and her voice came through the amphitheater speakers with a clarity that made every delegate pad go still. "The extraction fleet is 40 minutes from the threshold gate. The gate's master override protocol can only be input from the deep space side by 3 authorized operators. All 3 are on that fleet. When they clear the gate and input the sequence." She stopped. She did not need to finish the sentence. Zalvian understood. His eyes were as wide as she had ever seen them. "Stop that fleet," he said. The Assembly's Rapid Response Interceptor Group, 7 warships rated for pursuit interdiction, launched from the inner docking ring 17 minutes after Keth's priority channel report. They were fast ships, built for exactly this kind of situation. A transit lane interception, a legal seizure of infrastructure assets, a clean physical stop of a target convoy before it cleared the perimeter. They crossed the outer transit corridor in good order. Their firing solution computers ran the intercept vectors. The fleet of heavy industrial hulls was large, slow-moving by comparison, and on a straight line toward the gate. On paper, the intercept was straightforward. The intercept did not go as planned. The extraction fleet did not slow down or alter course. It did not respond to the Assembly's formal seizure broadcast, which was transmitted twice in the 4 primary languages of the Sunder League and once in the human standard dialect. It did not attempt to running, for heavy industrial hulls at 30% of light speed, was not a meaningful option. What it did was something the interceptor group's tactical systems had not been programmed to anticipate. It spread. Not randomly. The hulls separated into a precise geometric array, each one moving to a specific position calculated to a degree of mathematical precision that the interceptor group's own navigation systems took 11 seconds to model. Admiral Vikram, whose name Keth would not learn until later, but whose vector math she would study for a long time after, had mapped the firing arcs of all 7 interceptor warships against every possible pursuit configuration, and had distributed the extraction fleet through the resulting gaps with the same patience and thoroughness that characterized everything else the humans had done over the past 48 hours. The interceptor's firing solutions collapsed. The pursuit vectors crossed each other. 3 of the 7 warships spent 45 seconds burning lateral drives to avoid collision with each other. In those 45 seconds, the leading hulls of the extraction fleet reached the threshold gate's outer approach corridor. Keth watched the tracking display from her terminal, standing in the corridor outside the assembly chamber, and felt the clicking start in her mandibles before she could stop it. No shots fired, no hulls rammed, nothing damaged, nothing burned. The interceptors had simply been outplaced, the way a lever is outplaced when someone moves the fulcrum and you are still pushing in the direction the fulcrum used to be. The first hull cleared the gate threshold. Then the second. Then the third and the fourth, and the long, quiet, orderly line of the rest. Vance was the third operator through the gate. He had not moved from his seat during the intercept. He had heard the assembly's seizure broadcast. It came through the ship's general channel, formal and loud, and the cabin around him had gone very still when it played. A woman 2 rows back had put her hand over her daughter's. A man near the forward bulkhead had closed his eyes. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward the emergency exit panels or asked what happened now. They already knew what happened now. They had known for 11 years. Vance watched through the transit window as the leading hulls of the fleet moved through the gate's outer approach corridor. The gate was massive up close, far larger than any schematic suggested, its plated arches wide enough to pass a small city, the deep space side of it dark and unmarked and permanent in the way that things built by people who intend to build them once and well tend to be permanent. There was no ceremony to the crossing. One hull went through, then another, then his. The gate's interior was 30 seconds of dark, then open space, and the stars ahead looked different from the stars behind in a way Vance could not have precisely named but recognized immediately. The way a room looks different when you have shut the door behind you rather than left it open. He turned the iron ring on his finger once slowly. Then he took it off and set it on the window ledge in front of him, where it sat in a thin bar of starlight, not spinning. The master override protocol required 3 things in sequence: the first operator's code, the second operator's code, and a final confirmation from the third. The sequence had to be completed from the deep space side. It had to be completed within 10 minutes of the first input. The first code went in at the 8-minute mark after Vance's hull cleared the gate. The second went in at 9 minutes. Vance's terminal chimed with the confirmation request at 9 minutes and 40 seconds. He put his hand flat on the authorization panel and held it there. On the Sunderleague side of the gate, the interceptors had reformed their pursuit line and were accelerating toward the outer approach corridor. The lead ship was 40 seconds out when Vance pressed the confirm key. The gate moved. It did not slam. It did not crash. The massive plated arches of the threshold gate swung inward on their tracks with the slow, deliberate weight of a thing that has been engineered to last 10,000 years and has been maintained for exactly that purpose. And the mechanical latches, 4 of them, each the size of a docking bay, dropped into their housings with a sound that the local subspace array carried outward in all directions as a dull, low pulse. It took 11 seconds from the first movement to the last latch. On the 12th second, the gate's exterior running lights shifted from green to off. The lead interceptor pulled up hard. The other 6 spread around it. 7 warships stopped in a line outside a gate that no longer had a mechanism they could reach, operated by people they could no longer contact, held by latches built to a tolerance that made forced entry a project of decades. The operator list on the Sunderleague's maintenance registry now showed 3 names with a status notation beside each one. Authorization transferred, deep space jurisdiction, non-recoverable. Back in the assembly chamber, the lights had dropped another 7%. Nobody had called for a recess. The 127 bioluminescent delegate pads were all lit, which was unusual for a session that had already run past the standard close time. But unusual things had been happening at an accelerating rate for 48 hours, and staying in the chamber felt, to most of the delegates, preferable to returning to quarters and sitting alone with the sector map. Zalvian stood at the high dais with his ivory sash very straight, and his eyes in a configuration Keth had no category for. She had cataloged 12 distinct configurations of Vantic Senior Delegate I states over her career. This was not one of them. It was the configuration, she decided, of a person standing in a building and noticing, for the first time, that they cannot feel the floor. The subspace relay channel to the threshold gate showed static. Draft the emergency rescission, Zalvian said. Full revocation of the banishment order. Restore all human trade charters at pre-decree standing. Transmit immediately on the priority band. The aide keyed the transmission. The channel ran for 40 seconds. Then the relay confirmed delivery, delivered to a receiver array that was no longer connected to a terminal on the other side. The signal went where the line went, and the line ended at the gate's interior relay, and the gate's interior relay had gone dark when the running lights went off. The static continued. Zalvian looked at the static for a long moment. Then he looked at the assembly floor. The floor looked back. No speeches, no triumph, no argument, just 127 sets of eyes and one static-filled subspace channel, and the particular quality of silence that fills a room when a door has been shut from the other side, and everyone in the room understands simultaneously that there is no handle on this side. Kath left the chamber before the session formally closed. She walked down 3 levels to her terminal in the monitoring hub and sat in front of the sector map for a long time without opening any new files. The map was mostly orange now. Not red, not yet. The critical failure window the directorate had projected was still 30-some hours out, which meant there was still time for the inner systems to begin the slow, expensive, very difficult work of learning to maintain what they had been handed decades ago and had never had to think about. She thought about what that would look like, the engineers who would need to be trained, the documentation that would need to be written from scratch, the years of accumulated workaround knowledge that was now on the other side of a sealed gate, in the heads and hands of people who were moving away from it at 30% of light speed and would not be coming back. She pulled up a blank report file. She labeled it with a classification code that meant it would go to the restricted archive. The files that existed for the record rather than for immediate action. The files that someone would read in 30 or 40 years when they were trying to understand how a thing happened. She started typing. She did not type quickly. She chose each word the way she had always chosen things she was certain of, carefully, in order, without redundancy. The threshold gate closed at 49 hours and 12 minutes after the Sunder League Assembly's unanimous vote to revoke human systemic standing. The gate was sealed from the deep space side by authorized human operators using a master override protocol that predates the current Assembly administration by 22 years. The protocol was maintained in the authorized operator registry without interruption during that period. The infrastructure dependency now facing the 7 ring sectors reflects a structural relationship that was not represented in the pre-vote technical assessment. This report constitutes the Directorate's formal record of that gap. She stopped, she read it back. Then she added one more line. The maintenance logs of the human technical crews assigned to the 7 ring sector's infrastructure, the full operational record of what was maintained, how it was maintained, and by whom, have been compiled and submitted to the Threshold Monument Archive as the permanent record of their service. The names are in the log. She saved the file. She locked it with her administrative code and routed it to the restricted archive, where it would sit behind a classification wall until someone had a reason to look. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the orange sector map and thought about OSI and the pressure gauge and the steady needle, and what it meant that a needle could be steady for 11 years and then not be steady anymore, and whether the thing it measured had ever actually belonged to the people who had been reading the dial. In the 49th hour, Amara was asleep. She had been asleep for most of the transit, in the way children sleep when they are not frightened, deeply, sideways, one arm folded under her head and the other hanging loose. The compartment lights were low. Through the forward window, the star-dense dark of deep space held the kind of light that had no source you could point to. Just a general, distributed glow of things that were very old and very far away, and completely indifferent to the question of who had built what or who had voted for what, 50 light-years behind, and getting further by the minute. Chen was awake. She sat with her cloth bag on her lap and the brass pressure gauge held in both hands, not looking at the dial, just holding it the way you hold a thing that has been in your hands for a long time and has the particular weight of familiarity. The face of it caught the light from the window, dark slate behind brass, and the needle inside the glass sat at rest, perfectly still, not measuring anything, not connected to a line, not reporting a value. Just a needle and the position it settled when there was no pressure to read. It had not registered zero. It had just stopped being connected to anything that needed reading. She set it back in the bag, between the framed picture and the calibration tool, and looked out the window at the star with no name yet. The one Amara had decided to call Puddles, burning quietly at a distance that the ship's navigation system would calculate and confirm in the morning, and that tonight was simply there, simply burning, simply waiting for someone to arrive. The Gantu's promise moved toward it without hurrying. The gate, 50 light-years behind, was dark. The needle was still.